Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, a couple of days ago, I read an article about Cowboys football player Dez Bryant, and he made some controversial statements on Instagram. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read excerpts from those statements, and then I'm going to provide my commentary. In the description box, I will include a link to an article that has all the information that I'm talking about. You could read it for yourself and judge it for yourself. So the first thing that Dez Bryant does is he quotes Charles Barkley. And this is the quote from Charles Barkley. "We as black people were never going to be successful, not because of white people, but because of other black people." And Dez Bryant goes on to say that he understands that quote, and he's basically suggesting that he co-signs it, that he agrees with it. So let me go further. Dez Bryant also talks about how he's been racially profiled on numerous occasions. And he says, "Not once has it influenced an ill feeling inside of me about anyone outside of that issue." And then he goes on to talk about this. He says, "Instead of making videos about the history of racism, we should focus on individual accountability to be better as a whole." Then he goes on to say this. He says, "What's wrong with being sophisticated and black? Why do we associate those who choose the straight and narrow as not being black enough? As not being black enough." So let's break this down. You know, this quote from Charles Barkley basically suggests that black people are their own worst enemy. That black people are the ones preventing black people from reaching success. And I think that that's a simplistic, unsophisticated, and just outright false statement, because there are all kinds of barriers to success. And a lot of those barriers deal with institutionalized racism. I think that too often we have a childish definition of racism. We only view racism as some skinheads or some other hate group like the KKK, or someone using the N-word, or blatant and obvious discrimination. That's not the only form of discrimination. The most insidious form, the form that impacts our life on the greatest scale, is institutionalized racism. You know, and that affects us in every aspect of life, whether we're talking about education, where our young people are forced to go to inferior schools with inferior resources, with, less equipment. They can't compare to affluent white schools. Whether we're talking about economics as well, where you have massive wealth disparities between black people and white people. Black people earn less even if they're equally educated as whites. And black people simply have less wealth than white people. I've quoted it over and over again, and I will not stop. There's an article in the Nation magazine that points out how it would take the average black family over 220 years to amass the same level of wealth as the average white family. So that's an example of institutional racism. When you look at the criminal justice system, a system that is more harsh when it comes to African Americans. African Americans are targeted by the system. They are more harshly sentenced by the system. If you just look at the war on drugs, even though black and white people use and sell drugs at equal rates, black people are the ones that are more harshly convicted. Black people are the ones who are disproportionately in prison. We have the problem of mass incarceration in our community, as documented in Michelle Alexander's masterpiece, The New Jim Crow. If you look at the health disparities, the health conditions that exist in our community, if you look at the issue of police brutality and how it plagues our community, all of these things are barriers to success. You know, about 40% of those people who are unarmed and killed by the police are African American men, even though African American men only make up 6% of the U.S. population. Those are real barriers to success. Those institutional problems Those examples of institutionalized racism hold us back more than any black person ever could. So I think that that statement is an exaggeration, a statement that Charles Barkley made. I think that such statements are designed to make white people feel at ease. They're designed to absolve society of its responsibility for black people and less fortunate people. And it basically says that racism is not the problem and it blames the victim for their condition. I think that such a statement ignores the history that affects us today, the history of slavery, where you had black people denied the right to build wealth for hundreds of years. We were forced to work for free, and our free labor built the wealth of others. All kinds of institutions benefited from our enslavement. Whether you're talking about the federal government, whether you're talking about banks, insurance companies, schools, colleges, all kinds of institutions financially benefited from our enslavement. And because of that, that legacy, many of those businesses are prosperous and many of those families are prosperous today while we are impoverished today. So, I reject this false notion that, we weren't going to be successful because of other black people. It completely ignores that legacy that I discussed. And, another statement that he made about this racial profiling, undermines his point about not needing to make videos about the history of racism. I mean, here you have a man who acknowledges that he's been racially profiled on numerous occasions, but yet this same man has the nerve, has the gall, has the audacity to say that there is no need to do videos about the history of racism when we still suffer from racism. We have to understand the importance of history. History is very important. It's important not so that we can just know about the past. It's important so that we can plan for the future. It's important so that we can learn how to deal with present day conditions. I mean, here we have present day issues of racism, and yet you have this man who has the nerve to say that we shouldn't be talking about racism, that we shouldn't be addressing racism. And I think that statements like these are just designed to keep these white people at ease, to make them feel safe, and to create some popularity, because when you have these new blacks, these new Negroes who forget about racism, downplay racism, it helps them out in their career. White people, some white people sing their praises, they get more endorsements. It's the formula for success. It's the Michael Jordan formula, where you ignore the problems that face the people so that you can benefit individually and personally at the expense of your own people. And I just think that we don't need any more like punkified athletes like that. We need people who had the courage to speak out. We need people like a Colin Kaepernick to boldly speak out. We need people like a Muhammad Ali from back in the day. Here you have all these pressing issues affecting black people, and you have this tap dancing Negro talking about we don't need any videos about the history of racism. Racism is not a thing of the past, as this man even acknowledges himself. So, that's what I have to say about that. He goes on to say we should focus on individual accountability. And obviously, I support personal responsibility. Everyone should strive to be the best person that they can be. They shouldn't just sit back and blame society for their problems without trying to do anything for themselves, without trying to better themselves through education or by learning a trade or using some other skill that they have to earn a living and to do for themselves and their families. Obviously, people should try to take responsibility for their own actions, make proper choices. Obviously, nobody's disputing that. Obviously, people should plan out, their lives, their family life and all that kind of stuff. Plan out, their children, the birth of their children and all that kind of stuff, not engage in destructive behaviors like, get involved in gangs and drugs and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, that's a no-brainer. But that doesn't address the larger question. And that's the question of institutionalized racism, the continuing problem of racism. Just because somebody takes personal responsibility and they behave well and act well and speak the King's English, get an education, none of that stuff is some kind of protection against racism. I mean, here you have this guy who is a successful football player, but he acknowledges that he is still discriminated against. He's still racially profiled, but he wants to put on a show and basically pretend like it's no big deal and he has no ill feelings about that. And I just think that that's ridiculous, man. That reflects the turn the other cheek mentality, the love your enemy mentality. And I'm like, to hell with that stuff. We don't need any more weak people like that. We don't need that kind of weak mentality, that forgiving mentality, that turn the other cheek mentality. We don't need it. So, the bottom line is this: no matter how much personal responsibility you take, no matter how educated you are, as long as you are a black person in this society, you are going to be subjected to racism, either on an individual level or on a collective level, as I talked about before. Now, this whole issue about being perceived as not black enough when you're on the straight and narrow, I think that that's ridiculous. I don't see that in my real life. I hear these people say, well, you're viewed as white if you're trying to get an education. That hasn't been my experience. And maybe it's because of who I'm surrounded by. Maybe it's because of the influences that I've had in my life. But, I had plenty of positive examples around me. I had my uncle who was a lawyer. So for me, the idea of being a black lawyer wasn't something that I viewed as unattainable, because I had someone in my family, in my circle, who was actually a lawyer. And, I didn't view, we didn't view somebody getting an education as acting white. Someone speaking proper English, we didn't view that as acting white. We didn't view education as some kind of sign of not being black enough. And I don't know these black people who had those kind of views. I've had examples of black men who've obtained status and success, black doctors, black educators. So for me, black excellence wasn't something to look down upon. Like if a black person is successful on the quote unquote straight and narrow, I'd never look down at them or view them as not being black enough. I went to a black college. I went to Howard University, and I was surrounded by black excellence, by black people on the quote unquote straight and narrow. I didn't view them as not being black enough. And the people that I was around, they didn't view each other as that, like that. So I don't know where these people are getting these ideas from. These ideas that if you're on the straight and narrow, somehow you're not black enough. I just think that that's a fiction. That's one of these urban legends that get spreaded and people buy into. That just has not been my experience, where people view success as acting white or not being black enough. So those are some of my thoughts about this. Tell me what y'all think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.